Okay, so imagine this 1940 Battle of Britain, right? Everything's on the line,
Right.
and you've got this young pilot climbing into his Spitfire. The engine's roaring, and he's about to go head-to-head with the Luftwaffe, knowing this could be like his last flight ever.
Hmm.
But here's the thing. This isn't just any pilot. This is Sailor Malan,
Sailor
a
Malan.
South African guy who becomes this total legend. He fought not one, but three huge battles in his life.
Yeah, and what grabs you about Malan is that his story, it's not all, gung-ho war hero stuff. It's about a man who fought his own demons too, challenged authority, and just went after injustice wherever he found it. From those dogfights over England to taking on apartheid back in South Africa, his life, it's a story of courage and really sticking to your beliefs.
So we're diving deep into Sailor Malan's life today, using this podcast called Face the Attack, the three battles of Sailor Malan as our guide. Get ready for a wild ride, part war epic, part personal struggle, and all about how strong the human spirit can be.
And what's really cool about this deep dive is that it goes way beyond just the Battle of Britain stuff that everybody knows. We're going to uncover stuff about Malan that most people haven't heard, like his complicated relationship with South Africa and his battle with Parkinson's disease.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Malan was born in South Africa in 1910. And get this, his nickname, Sailor, came from his time in the Merchant Navy before he found his real calling, up in the air.
It's kind of funny, right? He finds his destiny not out on the ocean, but in the sky. And that little detail, it hints at all the crazy turns his life would take. He becomes this big hero in Britain, famous, recognized. The kind of stuff most people can't even imagine. But back in South Africa, he ends up being called a traitor by a lot of people because he was so against apartheid. Talk about a mixed legacy.
Yeah, it shows you that history is never simple, right? One man can be the good guy and the bad guy, depending on who's telling the story. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. The three battles that made Sailor Malan who he was World War II, the fight against apartheid, and his own struggle with Parkinson's.
Each one of those battles shows us a different side of this guy. His bravery and how good he was at strategy as a pilot. His total commitment to justice and willingness to challenge anyone. And how incredibly tough he was when things got really personal.
Okay, so picture it, 1940. The world is holding its breath as the Luftwaffe is just pounding Britain. It's a total David and Goliath situation.
Yeah.
The whole country is at stake, and that's where Sailor Malan enters the scene.
And he makes one heck of an entrance. Just a week into combat, he scores his first victory over Dunkirk. Can you imagine the adrenaline, the intensity? He described it later as like tasting blood. That's how raw and real air combat was.
Powerful image, right? It gives you a look inside the mind of a young pilot thrown into this crazy war. But Malan wasn't some thrill seeker. He was a brilliant tactician, a leader who obsessed over strategy and making sure his guys came home safe.
He wasn't just about fighting. He wanted to win. And he wanted his whole squadron to make it. He moved up the ranks fast, became squadron leader of 74 Squadron, the famous Tigers. He drilled those pilots constantly, pushed them to be the absolute best, and his motto was all over the airfield, practice, practice, practice.
Sounds like the kind of leader you'd want in your corner. Tough but fair, demanding but inspiring. But what really set Malan apart was how brilliant he was at strategy. He came up with his famous 10 rules of air fighting. They weren't just about individual skill, it was about teamwork, about surviving in the middle of all that chaos.
Yeah, those rules scribbled down on a piece of paper became legendary. They were posted up everywhere in England. They were common sense mixed with sharp observation. And this deep understanding of what goes on in a pilot's head during a dogfight, like wait until you see the whites of his eyes. It sounds like a movie line, right?
It does.
But it shows how much Malan emphasized being precise, not taking stupid risks.
And then there's always turn and face the attack.
Exactly.
That says a lot about his courage, refusing to back down from anything.
Those weren't just words. They saved a lot of pilots. That was Malan making sure his men were protected.
And it wasn't just his fellow pilots who benefited from his courage. Get this, the night his son was born, Malan was up there fighting German bombers.
Wow.
Shot down 2 of them, came home a father and a hero.
Wow.
Talk about intense.
Yeah, can you imagine the emotions that night? The joy of a new baby, the fear for his family, the rush of combat, it's all there.
It really shows how intense his life was.
Right.
And the weight of the world he carried.
But even with all that hero stuff, he still had those moments where he was just a regular guy. He said later that asking Winston Churchill to be his son's godfather was one of the scariest things he ever did. It's a funny story. It makes this larger-than-life guy seem human again.
It reminds you that even heroes get nervous. They feel the same stuff we do.
And those little glimpses into his personal life, that's what makes him so interesting. He's not just a name in a history book. He's a real person. Hopes, fears, and this deep sense of duty that made him fight for what he believed in, even when it meant going up against the most powerful people.
But Malan didn't just kick back after the Battle of Britain. He kept serving leading wings at Biggin Hill, training new pilots. But there was something else going on, too. He started getting really frustrated with how outdated some of the tactics were. And he wasn't afraid to say something, even if it meant going up against the top brass.
That says a lot about him. He wasn't just a great pilot, he was a thinker, a leader who wasn't scared to challenge the way things were done, even if it ruffled some feathers. And under all that frustration, he was fighting another battle too. The battle against burnout, the constant pressure, losing friends, the emotional toll of it all. It starts to wear you down.
It's easy to forget that even the toughest guys, the most courageous people, they have their limits.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of Malan's story that people don't always see. It reminds us that being a hero doesn't mean you don't feel fear or get exhausted. It's about pushing through all that, finding the strength to keep going even when you feel like you can't.
And for Malan, that break finally came when he went back home. But it wasn't the hero's welcome he probably expected. It was the start of his second, and maybe his toughest battle.
In 1946, Malan goes back to South Africa, decorated war hero. He's probably thinking everyone's going to be thrilled to see him. But things had changed back home. The National Party, they had these segregationist policies, and they were gaining power. This was the beginning of apartheid, a system that would really mess things up in South Africa for decades.
And this is where Malan's story gets really interesting. The guy who fought against tyranny in Europe. Now he's facing a whole different kind of enemy, the racism and injustice in his own country.
It's almost like a Greek tragedy. The hero comes home from this huge victory only to find out his own home has become the battleground. But Malan wasn't the type to just sit back and watch. He couldn't ignore what was happening. He'd fought fascism overseas. How could he stay silent when there was oppression happening right in front of him?
So he starts speaking out against apartheid, challenging the very government he used to serve. That took guts. He knew he was putting his reputation on the line. He was going to lose friends and make enemies, and he was making himself a target for a government that was becoming more and more authoritarian.
This wasn't just politics. This was about basic human rights. Malan believed that everyone in South Africa, no matter their race, deserved to be treated equally. And he was willing to fight for that belief, even if it meant standing alone.
And speaking out made him a target. People called him a traitor. A lot of white South Africans turned their backs on him, and the government was watching him. They saw him as a threat. It's crazy how fast a hero can fall from grace when they challenge the way people think.
Yeah, and it's sad to see how societies can turn on people who dare to question things, especially when it comes to deep-seated prejudice.
But even with all that backlash, the isolation, people calling him a traitor, Malan didn't back down. He kept speaking out against apartheid, giving a voice to the people who were being silenced, using his platform to show the world just how messed up the system was.
He found strength in his beliefs, in knowing he was fighting for what was right, and he had his family and close friends, the people who knew the real him, the people who believed in a better, fairer South Africa. But this was a battle on multiple fronts, and while he was fighting apartheid, another enemy was sneaking up on him, a much more personal one. In the late 1950s, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It's a terrible neurological disorder that slowly takes away your physical abilities.
It almost feels unfair. This guy who faced down enemy fighters, stood up to authority, fought for justice. Now he's got to fight an enemy inside his own body, an enemy that's stealing his strength and coordination.
It reminds you that life can throw you a curveball, even if you're the kind of person who seems like they can handle anything. But even with this awful disease, Malan showed the same toughness he always had.
He refused to let Parkinson's control him. He kept living his life as fully as he could, enjoying his family, doing the things he loved, never forgetting the causes he believed in.
That's incredible. It shows how powerful the human spirit is to adapt, to find meaning, even when you're facing tough times. Malan's story isn't just about winning battles. It's about facing challenges with grace and determination, about never giving up, even when it seems like there's no hope.
It's tough to think that after everything he went through, all the fighting, that his own country just turned its back on him.
Yeah, you're talking about him not getting a military funeral in South Africa, right? It's kind of unbelievable. This is a guy who put his life on the line for his country, became a legend flying over Europe, and his own government wouldn't even honor him after he died.
It really shows how complicated history can be, how politics and ideology can just overshadow incredible acts of courage and sacrifice.
But at least his story didn't go completely unnoticed. Even though the South African government said military people couldn't go to his funeral, the U.S. Air Force sent someone to pay their respects. That was a big deal. It was like they were saying, we see you, we recognize what you did. It went beyond countries and politics.
It shows you that sometimes real heroes get recognized in the most unexpected ways,
Huh?
and that what they do can reach so much further than anyone ever imagined.
Exactly. Malan's story resonated with people all over the world. They were inspired by his courage, his integrity, his unwavering dedication to fighting for what he believed in.
So after diving into Sailor Malan's life, what are the big takeaways from his journey?
Well, one of the most important things is that there are a lot of ways to be a hero. It's not always about these big, grand gestures or winning battles on the battlefield. Sometimes it's about having the guts to stand up for what you believe in, even if it means going against the crowd, even if it costs you something.
Like when Malan went against apartheid. Even though it meant a lot of people in his own country would turn against him, that takes serious bravery.
Absolutely. And it also shows that heroes are human. They have flaws, they mess up, they get tired and frustrated. Malan wasn't like Superman. He was a guy dealing with tough situations, making difficult decisions, and sometimes not living up to his own ideals.
And that actually makes his story even more interesting, because it's something we can relate to. It reminds us that we're all capable of great things, but we're also going to mess up sometimes.
I agree completely. And I think the last takeaway from Malan's life is the power of resilience. This guy faced so much adversity, war, political persecution, a serious illness, and he never gave up. He kept fighting, kept adapting, kept finding ways to have a meaningful life.
That's an important message, especially for people who are going through difficult times. It shows that even when things look bad, there's always a way to keep going, to find strength, to make a difference.
Malan's story reminds us that we can all be heroes in our own way. It might not be about shooting down enemy planes, but maybe it's standing up for what's right, fighting for something you believe in, or just being kind and compassionate to the people around you.
So if you're looking for a story that'll inspire you, challenge you, and leave you feeling hopeful, I definitely say check out Sailor Malan's life. You can find the podcast, Face the Attack, The 3 Battles of Sailor Malan, wherever you get your podcasts.
It's a journey worth taking. It's a story that'll stick with you.
And who knows? It might even inspire you to be a little braver, a little more outspoken, and a little more determined to make the world a better place.